I'm Benjamin Warren, and I have the privilege of serving as chair of Holocaust Museum Houston. Welcome to our temporary space we call home, while our main campus is under a dramatic expansion to nearly triple the size. Today is a special honor for Holocaust Museum Houston as we officially open the exhibition In the Country of Numbers, Where the Men Have No Names. Holocaust Museum Houston is proud to be the first museum in the U.S. to host this extraordinary exhibition that tells the story of 6,000 Jewish men, most from Berlin, who were imprisoned in Sachsenhausen following the November pogrom night Kristallnacht. Tomorrow is the 80th anniversary and the official opening day of the exhibition. Holocaust Museum Houston will hold free admission to the museum in honor of this important day in history. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to ask that our survivors and their descendants who are present today to please stand and be recognized. Thank you for your... Now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Jason Levy. Born and raised in the New York metropolitan area, Jason is the youngest child of Holocaust refugees. Jason is currently a social studies teacher at the George M. Steinbrenner High School, thank you, near Tampa, Florida, where he incorporates his family's Holocaust experiences into his world history classes in order to help his students better connect with history in a meaningful way. And Jason, we are absolutely delighted to welcome you here.
Just 13 days ago, less than 2 weeks, 11 people were gunned down at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue. And if you'll indulge me, I would like to pause for a moment of silence before we get started.
Should we stand up?
If you would like to. Thank you. That was about 11 seconds. That's 11 seconds for 11 victims of what the Anti-Defamation League has called the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in the history of the United States. But tonight's not about Pittsburgh, is it? It's about the opening of a museum exhibit to commemorate the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht. The exhibit's called In the Country of Numbers, Where the Men Have No Names. Well, let's look at some numbers for a moment. Those 11 Pittsburgh victims had names in alphabetical order. Number 1 was Joyce Feinberg. Number 2, Richard Gottfried. Number 3, Rose Mallinger. Number 4, Jerry Rabinowitz. Number 5, Cecil Rosenthal. Number 6, David Rosenthal. Number 7, Bernice Simon. Number 8, Sylvan Simon. Number 9, Daniel Stein. Number 10, Melvin Wax. Number 11, Irving Younger. 11 killed, 6 more wounded, including 4 police officers. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, sees meaning in numbers. The most famous, of course, is 18, Chai. 18 represents life. We're constantly confusing the outside world when we make donations in multiples of 18 instead of 10. Last year, a Muslim mosque had been vandalized. and members of my community pulled together to make donations. The imam was confused by the numbers until he realized that a good number of Jews had been making donations of $18, $36, $180, all multiples of 18. Numbers have a special place in Judaism. 6 million Jewish souls killed in the Holocaust. 6 points on the Jewish Star of David. 6 people left wounded in Pittsburgh, left to wonder why they survived when so many others didn't. Perhaps they survived to bear witness to the events, to tell others of the hatred that shattered an otherwise peaceful baby naming ceremony. But we're here tonight to talk about Kristallnacht. Even that fateful night goes by several names. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Pogromnacht, even Reich Pogromnacht in some circles. Regardless of its name, the November pogrom is widely considered to be the beginning of the Holocaust, day number 1. Another 5 million non-Jews on top of the 6 million Jews killed. Add to that the millions believed lost in the Soviet Union. Who am I to speak for all those people? I don't have a PhD in Holocaust studies. I'm not a college professor. After a dozen years in the corporate world, I changed careers, largely inspired by my experience teaching confirmation classes at Tampa's Jewish Community Center. I've been teaching high school history now for 15 years. I'm currently on the faculty at George Steinbrenner High School, which in my humble opinion is one of the best in Florida. But surely the museum wouldn't have invited me here for that. What about the survivors themselves? Who am I to speak for those who suffered the direct physical and emotional pain, those who lost all or most of their families, their homes, and their standings in what had once been considered to be a modern civilized society? I'm not a survivor of the camps. It wasn't that long ago when I would take my young children to listen to survivors talk about their experiences. But that generation is quickly disappearing. What we're witnessing here is a passing of the torch, l'dor v'dor, from generation to generation. Who am I to speak for all those people? I'll tell you exactly who I am. I am the youngest child of refugees and the grandson of a former prisoner at the Sachsenhausen Concentration Camp. That's who I am. L'dor v'dor, from generation to generation, I am that next generation. Like the 6 survivors in Pittsburgh, it's our turn to bear witness, to tell the world what happened. To my students, I'm Mr. Levy, but I have other names too. My middle name is William, given to me to honor the memory of my paternal grandfather. That's my father on the right, born Heinz, but later known as Henry, with his own father Wilhelm, after whom I'm named. My first name is Jason, to honor the memory of my maternal grandfather, prisoner number 8500. That's the number given to him when he entered Sachsenhausen, but he had a name. The name given to him by his parents was Julius. That's him with my Uncle Harold. Judging by Harold's age in this picture, this must have been about the year 1933 or 1934, shortly after Hitler had been appointed chancellor. As a child, Harold had suffered from a high fever, but the German doctors refused to treat the young Jewish boy. And as a result, he suffered hearing loss and needed a hearing aid for the rest of his life. This is my uncle. Oops.
Just doing it down in the...
Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead. This is my uncle on the left in the white hat, as I remember him on his beloved sailboat, sailing the Long Island Sound probably. The guy on the right in this picture is Mario Levinson, whose testimony is also in the exhibit today. He goes by the name Bar Levy today. He took the name Levinson, which was his father's name, and when he made Aliyah to Israel, changed it to Bar Levy. Thank you. It was when my Uncle Harold passed away in 1997 that I inherited his genealogy research. My mother, Vera, also contributed her notes to my new family history project, including... We tried that too. but now I look like the demon from Fantasia. the night on Bald Mountain with the under that. Whatever makes you folks happy. All right, so my mother, Vera, also contributed her notes to my new family history project, including her English translation of the research done by her own father and uncle. I typed their disorganized notes into some genealogy software and uploaded it into a family history website. About 5 years ago, I heard from a cousin on my father's side of the family who had seen my research online, and we've since maintained an online friendship. During the summer of 2017, my wife Lauren, who's back there, and our 2 teenage kids, Ben and Hannah, traveled to Germany to meet our newly discovered family. That's Daniela, all the way on the left. She is the woman that contacted me online. Next to her is her daughter Noah, about the same age as my daughter. The next gentleman, his name is Axel. He is my 4th cousin on my father's side. So it goes something like my father's, mother's, father's, father's, brother's, son's, son. Something like that. After Axel is their son, Jacob, then Lauren, then my daughter Hannah, me, and my son Benjamin. The first part of our visit focused on my father's side of the family, but since this museum exhibit focuses on my mother's side, I'll save my father's story for later. After Daniela and her family served as hosts and tour guides, we left our German cousins behind and we set out across the country on our own. We don't speak German, so I don't know how we would have made it without Google Translate. I think Google may have earned the right to be my corporate overlord on that trip. Our first stop was Hamburg, where my mother was born and raised. This is my mother, with her brother Harold, who you met already, and her parents Julius and Henrietta Nathan. The Nathan family had lived in Hamburg for hundreds of years. This is the ancient Jewish cemetery at Königstrasse, where I have several ancestors buried, going back quite a number of centuries. Here we are at the grave of my 9th great-grandfather, Nathan Moses Spanier, who died in the year 1647.
Wow.
With a name like Spanier, we've long suspected that the family came out of Spain and Portugal during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. You'll notice the crack going through the headstone, and the top is missing completely. The entire cemetery had been vandalized by the Nazis, and our guide said the Hitler Youth actually used it as a soccer field. That's when my daughter lost it and started crying. The cemetery's official database contains a biography of Spanier, and our guide did her best to translate it for us. The Jews of Eastern Europe were the victims of ongoing violent pogroms. Spanier worked to resettle refugees who were simply looking for safety and a better life. We suspect this is why he was buried in the Ashkenazi style in the Ashkenazi section of the cemetery. That afternoon, I got an email from Daniela, who's nothing less than a genealogy wizard. Apparently, she discovered a document from Nathan Moses Spanier in the archives at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. We were planning on taking the train to Berlin the next day anyway, so I called the museum. They had the document waiting for us when we got there. The wax seal with the Star of David and the Spanish shield on it helped solidify our belief that the family had come out of Spain. We weren't planning on being in Berlin long, but I'm thankful we were able to squeeze in this special surprise. we were in Berlin for one reason, to visit the concentration camp my grandfather was in. The next day, we pushed on to Sachsenhausen. I had made a prior commitment to meet with Dr. Astrid Lay, the curator of the memorial at the camp, and she's also the brainchild behind today's exhibit. Dr. Lay gave us a guided tour and later interviewed me with today's exhibit in mind. She had already traveled to Israel to interview my cousin Mario. We started our tour at Sachsenhausen in the entry museum to get some background on the camp's construction.
In summer 1938, suddenly, they started the extinction of the camp, the so-called small camp, where the barracks were much narrower placed, like here. And in November 1938, for the first time, this place was filled with prisoners. 6,000 Jewish men from Berlin, from all the north of Germany.
Dr. Lay explained how the camp had been expanded in the months leading up to Kristallnacht, and the idea that the November pogrom was somehow a spontaneous uprising is pure fiction.
The Nazi propaganda always talked about this November pogrom being a spontaneous uprising. There was a young Jewish man who was living in Paris, and his parents fell victim to some kind of pogrom-like deportation of Polish Jews living for decades in Germany in the early autumn of 1938. And he was so angry about this that he went to the French embassy and injured, he didn't shoot him, but he injured him, the German ambassador there. And the Nazis took this for a reason to start up this November pogrom, burning synagogues in whole Germany, destroying the shops of Jewish people, destroying their flats, their apartments, their houses, but taking them prison.
Do you think that Kristallnacht would have happened anyway, even if that person hadn't shot?
They had prepared everything in Sachsenhausen to house these people.
So they were just waiting for an excuse.
Waiting for an excuse, exactly. This is what I was saying.
More than 6,000 Jewish men from Berlin, Hamburg, and all across northern Germany were brought to Sachsenhausen in just a few days. My grandfather, Julius Nathan, was one of those men. The story goes Julius had been getting on the bus and saw a friend who had apparently already been under arrest for being Jewish. When my grandfather said hello, his friend ignored him, trying to spare him the Gestapo's wrath. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and he was also arrested and sent to Sachsenhausen. Although many would later be brought by train, ironically, he had been brought by bus. We went into the camp to survey the actual area where my grandfather was housed. He had been given the prisoner number 8500 and assigned to barrack number 19.
So this is where barrack number 19 was. The one is missing. Yep.
Good to know. Good to know.
You can see where it was.
Yeah.
There. You can see there was a one there.
On the other side, if you want to take a photo, perhaps
So this is where the barrack was, where my grandfather was held. Barrack number 19. And these barracks were only Jewish prisoners. And this part of the camp was the extension getting ready for Kristallnacht. They knew they were going to do this. They were waiting just for an excuse.
Shortly after the arrests of their husbands, my grandmother, Henrietta, seen here in this picture, and her sister-in-law, Russian, Mario's mother, went to the SS to complain. Today, the thought of complaining to the SS is absurd. What we need to remember is that things had not gotten as bad as they were going to get. The Holocaust started slowly, first with the identification of the minority as a scapegoat for the country's problems, then talk of keeping them out of the country and removing those that were already present. The Nuremberg laws were passed, stripping that minority of citizenship. Detention centers were being built and readied for an influx of prisoners. Vigilante groups were worked up into a fervor until they acted, egged on by a racist government. At the time of Kristallnacht, there weren't any extermination camps yet. Those were still years away. So my grandmother went to the SS. She told them that my grandfather had been a German soldier during the World War. It wasn't yet numbered. There had only been one World War. The two brave women were told that the SS had orders to release prisoners, but didn't have time to process the paperwork. Without much choice, Henrietta and Russian volunteered their time to work in the SS office to process that paperwork. Through their efforts, they were able to get their husbands and countless others out of Sachsenhausen. They survived, while others weren't so lucky. My mother described her father's weakened condition upon his return home. He had lost weight, he had scars on his head, and his gums were bleeding from malnutrition. But at least he had come home. The family started maneuvering to get out of Germany. After all, at that point, that was the Nazis' goal. It wasn't to exterminate the Jews, just to drive them out. Extermination was the final solution. My mother was the first one out of the family. At the age of 13, she was one of the children to be rescued as a part of the kinder transport. She was in England for a few years before rejoining her family in the United States. As a child, I first became aware of my parents' trauma accidentally. I had been rummaging around the attic of the house I grew up in, and I found an old moth-bitten hat. When I brought it out to show my mother, she let out a primal scream, the kind that is usually reserved for horror movies. When I looked closer at the hat, I saw it had a swastika on it. It was probably a war souvenir brought back and forgotten by the previous owner of the house. The next day, when I got home from school, the hat was gone. This is some artwork by my mother later on. I threw this in at the last second. She was an artist, painted all her life, worked in an art gallery, and now I can say her art was on display in the museum. I remember in the early 1970s, my mother had gone back to visit Germany at the invitation of the city of Hamburg. When she got back, she said she would never go to Germany again, claiming that the anti-Semitism of her youth is still there. I always wondered whether that was true or not, or if it was just this psychological scarring left over from her childhood. Then I went myself, except for one really bizarre encounter at a restaurant in Berlin. Everyone I met was friendly. But there is one thing Dr. Lay said to me that has stuck with me. I asked Dr. Lay about the attitude of the German people after the war and today. Here's what she said.
It was common knowledge in Germany. It was common knowledge was going on. The people didn't really want to know what was going on, but everybody knew what was going on.
A lot of the prisoners came by train and got off the same train station we did, and then they were marched from the train station to the camp.
Being beaten, being guarded by SS-men, being terribly fed, malnutritioned, looking weak, looking injured. The people could see that, and there was a huge crematorium here, and the smoke of this crematorium was all over town every day. So.
And they must have known.
They must have
and
known.
they were yelling at the prisoners, and when we got off the train, I kind of half-jokingly looked on the map and said, oh, according to Google Maps, it would take us about 25 minutes to walk.
Yeah.
And we took a taxi instead.
Yeah.
So that would have been a 25-minute march for them through town. And the people were yelling at them.
Yeah.
The children were yelling at them, throwing stones at them, calling them names.
Yeah.
Those little children are the older generation in Germany today. Oh, sure. Yes, go in the shade. What is the thought process of that older generation today?
In the beginning, they were yelling at the Jewish prisoners, but in many cases, then someone of their family was taken by the Gestapo. So it was not so easy to not all of them were only on the perpetrator's side, but all others could experience what National Socialism is in their own families quite soon, and so they a little bit got away from this being so Nazi-like, and the good economy in Germany and the West integration and the way the West German state showed them that democracy is much better than standing in lines in the Hitlerjugend. But it was more by feeding them nicely and giving them many advantages than by, I don't know.
It wasn't an ideological thing. It was more practical.
Yeah.
So after the Second World War, they're being numbered now, the attitude persisted. But it was inconvenient to be racist. What happens when it's no longer inconvenient? What happens if a nationalist leader were to come to power and stir up all that hatred? I think that's very telling. Not necessarily that Germany is something we should be worried about. Extremism exists all around the world. It's a cancer that can infect even the most civilized of societies. L'dor v'dor, from generation to generation, it is incumbent upon us, the next generation, to watch out for similar patterns of racism and extremism wherever it may be. My father's family is not part of today's museum exhibit, but his parents and his older sister were also refugees from Nazi Germany. During our visit 2 summers ago, our cousin Daniela arranged for us to meet with the official archivist of the town of Hattingen, where my father's mother had been born and raised. And we went to Gladbeck and saw the building my father was born in exactly 100 years before. It's a Turkish restaurant today. My father wasn't one to talk about himself, but occasionally my mother and I were able to get something out of him. After watching the German people democratically elect more and more Nazis into the national legislature throughout the 1920s, my grandparents saw the writing on the wall when full-fledged fascism had taken over with the appointment of Adolf Hitler in 1933. They had owned a shoe store called Agrippina in downtown Iserlohn, but when Hitler came to power, they sold the shoe store and started maneuvering to leave the country. My father left Germany by way of Czechoslovakia before joining his parents in what was then called Palestine. My father, then named Heinz, arrived in the United States in 1937, and this is the ship's manifest. He's about 5 lines down. He joined the army and was briefly stationed in Italy. He made his living in the hotels of New York City, first as a busboy and ultimately as a maitre d'. By the time I was growing up, He was the banquet manager at a country club on Long Island. Although neither one of my parents had the opportunity to finish their formal educations, they were both voracious readers. It's no wonder I would find my soulmate in a librarian. My parents were good. I'm sorry. Told myself to get through this. My parents were good and decent people. They had given a strong moral foundation to my 2 brothers, to my 1 sister, and to me. And here we are. This is what I just got this picture from my sister about 2 weeks ago. Up until then, I had one very blurry picture of all 4 of us together. My brother Frank is the eldest. He's 19 years older than I am. He and I never lived together. He was out of the house when I was born. My sister Joan is about a year younger. My brother Mark and I grew up together. Unfortunately, we lost him due to complications from multiple sclerosis back in 1995. He passed away, and then I'm over there on the left. As a teacher of world history with this emotional connection to the past, honestly, I'm finding it more difficult to maintain my political neutrality within the classroom. Since receiving the invitation for Miss Manley to speak with you here tonight, I have felt the heavy burden of history. Frankly, it's been an emotional roller coaster. I'm not on the speaking circuit. I'm not in the habit of telling people about my family's story. In fact, this is the very first time I've spoken about it to a group other than to my own students in my own classroom on my own turf. I am the child and grandchild of survivors. But what about the countless number of other children and grandchildren who simply never existed because their forebears may have suffered more than mine and never survived the Holocaust? It is impossible to count the number of children and grandchildren who simply never existed. It is our responsibility to tell the world about what happened, but more importantly, it's our responsibility to watch out for and point out historical similarities, as history does tend to repeat itself. We have to say never again, and mean it. Never again to Jews, never again to African Americans, never again to Muslims, Latinos, or any other group whose lives are in peril. My kids never had the chance to meet my mother. She passed away in 1999 at the age of 74, just 3 months before my son was born. My daughter's middle name is Vera, in memory of my mother. We lost my father at the age of 91 in 2008. From generation to generation. I'd like to conclude this evening with a brief video of my father just a few days before my son's first birthday, singing a song from his own childhood.
Want to see how that goes? That song that Granddaddy sings? Let's turn this around. Face me. Ah, then we go like this. Hoppe, hoppe, reiter, wenn dann fällt, dann schreit fällt in den Graben, fressen in die Raben. Oh, warum, 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 hoppe, 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 reiter. A reiter is a, what's a reiter? It's a rider. A rider on a horse, that's a reiter.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
What's the matter, Ben?
Okay. You're pulling the hair on my hand.
Yeah, he does that.
It hurts.
Wait till he gets a fistful of chest hair.
Ouch. Go ahead, you can go. Whoop. Okay. Oops. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Whoop, whoop, whoop.
Lador Vador. You and I, we are the next generation. Thank you.
is what this museum is all about. And we really thank you for opening yourself up and sharing some stories that were very personal and I think a bit painful, but a bit happy. And we were certainly happy to welcome the art to our museum.
Thank you. My mother would be pleased.
Thank you. And we'll enjoy visiting with you now. Thank you so much.
You know, like Paparai, my mother and my father used to sing to my children. Papa, kom uit, dan ben ik op schrijven. Graven, fressen, kijk in het zon, dan mag eruit op de grond.
Did the same thing?
Yeah.
That must be the thing to do.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for inviting me.
Jerry Ross.